More than 50 years ago, a freedom fighter from Denmark took on the deep state and its United Nations apparatus, and he paid with his life. You need to know the story. Stay tuned and I'll tell you more. Hey everybody, Alex Newman here. Welcome to another episode of Behind the Deep State. Thank you so much for tuning in. I came across this incredible story about a whistleblower, a freedom fighter who took on the monstrous United Nations and the communist control of the United Nations, and almost certainly was murdered for his heroic stand. I want to share this story with you today. It's been largely forgotten by official historians. You won't find him in the history textbooks, but it's such a tragic story and yet such a moving story at the same time that I wanted to share it with you. We've done a lot of work here at the New American, on this show here, Behind the Deep State, on Conversations That Matter, and on many other platforms about the many whistleblowers who've come out of the United Nations and tried to expose that cesspool of corruption and filth and lawlessness and child rape. I mean, you almost can't get worse than the United Nations. Top officials from the UN have estimated that over the last decade, based on the UN's own data, the UN's own numbers, more than 60,000 women and children have been raped. And the UN has a bad habit of basically terrorizing, demonizing, firing, and even threatening the whistleblowers instead of the people actually doing the crimes, the child rapists, the embezzlers, the thieves, the liars. And this is not a new phenomenon, folks, at the UN. I want to tell you about Pavel Bang-Jensen. He was a leading UN official. He's from Denmark. He actually had a long history of standing up for freedom. When the Nazis invaded his homeland, he helped set up the government in exile. He resisted very valiantly the Nazi occupation of his homeland. And after the war, he ended up as a senior official at the UN. And the story is just so incredible, folks. One of his assignments was to lead and work on this commission that was investigating Soviet atrocities in Hungary. And for those of you who don't remember, the Soviet Union was absolutely barbaric when they steamrollered into Hungary to put down an anti-communist rebellion. And that story is just, it's tragic in and of itself. In fact, the U.S. government helped to kind of bring that along. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But so the UN ostensibly set up a committee to help look into this. It was called the UN Special Committee on the Problem of Hungary. And it was supposed to investigate the savagery that the Soviets used in shutting down that uprising in Hungary in 1956. And so Povl Bang-Jensen was leading and working on this commission, and there were a lot of witnesses that wanted to testify. But, of course, those witnesses were very concerned about their family back in Hungary. If the Soviets found out that they had testified in this committee, they knew that their friends, their family would be tortured, might be executed, and, so they obviously had very real concerns. And so they insisted on anonymity to be able to testify. And Bang-Jensen actually got permission from the highest levels of the United Nations to protect their anonymity. And one of the things that the witnesses insisted on was that Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the UN at that time, never be allowed to find out who they were. He knew something was very, very suspicious with Dag Hammarskjöld. He didn't know exactly what, but the witnesses were very concerned that he would find out. So even U.S. authorities, there were serious concerns. In fact, the U.S. government had sent radio broadcasts into Hungary convincing the freedom fighters there that the U.S. government would step in and support them if they rose up against their barbaric Soviet and communist oppressors. And, of course, when they actually rose up and tried to throw off this communist tyranny, the U.S. government not only did not help, not only did not fulfill their promise to help, they actually did everything possible to help the Soviets crush that rebellion. In fact, they even blocked weapons shipments to the anti-communists in Hungary. That tells you a little bit about what was going on in the U.S. government at that time. And in the end, the Soviet tanks just rolled in there. They squashed the uprising. They murdered people. They terrorized people. And Stalin was able to maintain total control over Hungary. So Bang-Jensen was on this committee. And they were collecting testimony, and they were supposed to come up with a report about these horrors. And the report was supposed to go to the General Assembly, a dictator's club if there ever was one, so that they could at least find out what had actually happened in Hungary. Well, at every step of the investigation, Bang-Jensen said there were people very obviously trying to sabotage the operation in every possible way. They were using Soviet guards for the hearings, right? Talk about intimidating the witnesses, right? They call them UN guards, but really they're Soviets working for the UN, and of course they all work for their masters back in Moscow. So they were changing rooms, I mean, everything they could do. They were actually changing testimony in the official reports to block out things that would have been especially harmful to the Soviet Union. In every way, they were sabotaging the investigation. So Bang-Jensen tried to raise these concerns with his superiors. He went all the way up to the very top. He actually wrote a memo to Dag Hammarskjöld, the head of the UN, and he said sabotage of various kinds has gone on from the very beginning. He said some of these efforts were extremely clumsy, and yet Hammarskjöld was not interested in the slightest. In fact, he ordered Bang-Jensen to shut his mouth and keep playing along with the farce. Well, he was eventually ordered to hand over the names of the 81 Hungarian witnesses who had testified about this barbarism, and being a man of his word, understanding the mortal danger that would put these people and their family and friends in, said, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, he was so serious, he burned the list of witnesses just to make sure there was no possible way that they could end up with those documents. And for that, they began terrorizing him. They started smearing him in the press. They started saying nasty things about him. And he actually started warning that even the American delegations and the American government was infiltrated by the Soviet Union. In fact, Bang-Jensen warned of a high-ranking American serving within the UN who was passing very sensitive intelligence on to Moscow. U.S. intelligence was being passed on to communists. Well, according to an article in Newsweek, when Bang-Jensen passed this information along through U.S. channels, it was put in writing, even though they had promised, the Soviet defectors and the Soviet sources had said, please don't put it in writing. They put that in writing. And that, of course, made its way back to the American who was passing that intelligence on. And the Soviet diplomat that had been blowing the whistle and trying to pass this information to the Americans and trying to defect was quickly shipped back to the USSR. He disappeared. Nobody knows, officially at least, what happened to him. So Bang-Jensen felt terribly guilty about this, and he did not want that to happen again, especially with these witnesses who had put their lives and risked their families for this. He knew that if that information got out within the UN, even at the highest levels, was totally infiltrated by spies, terrorists, communists, that it would be a death sentence for many of the family members of those witnesses. So he tried his best to keep that information secret for obvious reasons. And that ended up costing him everything. Okay, that ended up, first of all, he lost his job in violation of the UN's own policies. They actually escorted him out of his office under armed guard, exactly the same thing they did to Anders Kompis, the Swedish diplomat who tried to expose the rape of children by UN peace troops in the Central African Republic. They literally marched him out of his office under armed guard as if he was some kind of criminal. They did the same thing to Bang-Jensen back in 1957. In July of 1958, he was officially fired, and the whole UN apparatus went into cover-up mode. They started leaking information to the press. They started saying he was a lunatic, that he was a homosexual, that he was too emotional, anything they could think of to smear him. He believed they were actually trying to drive him out of his mind. And it seems like that's what they were trying to do. He got very, very concerned about this, and he actually started fearing for his own life. He sent out letters to his friends and to his family saying, look, I would never, ever commit suicide. It's against my religion. It's against my most deeply held views. I would never commit suicide. Finally, the UN forced him to go see a shrink. Even the UN's own shrink said this guy's got a perfect bill of health. Quit, calling him a lunatic. He's not a lunatic. So the UN then started organizing these pseudo investigations. They put together these pathetic kangaroo panels and committees, just like they do today with whistleblowers, filled with communists, communist agents, communist sympathizers, aimed at demonizing Bang-Jensen. They didn't give him the documents or his lawyer the documents they needed to defend himself. They charged him with insubordination for failing to hand over the list of these witnesses. They called him mentally ill. They published all sorts of libelous smears in the newspaper about him. And this is a man who was trying to do the right thing, folks. But he knew, and the information he was getting was that the UN and the U.S. State Department and the CIA and other U.S. bureaucracies were filled with communist agents working for Moscow. which, we've done episodes on this before. Of course, the terrorist regime in Moscow was brought to power with help from very powerful Americans. Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, breaks that all down. So when you realize we've got a deep state here that is simply evil to the core, and this man stood up against them, and so they went after him. And to give you a sense of just how corrupt and how penetrated all these institutions were by communists, don't forget Alger Hiss, right? The U.S. State Department official who chaired the conference that wrote the UN Charter, then went on to lead the UN. We actually prosecuted him, and he was proven in a court of law to have been a communist agent. He was convicted of perjury for lying about that. But Bang-Jensen tried to sound the alarm, and he was unsuccessful because of all the deep state's attacks. Now, eventually, he quote-unquote committed suicide, even though he had warned everybody he would not commit suicide. He was found dead in a park in Queens County in New York on November 26, 1959, with a gunshot wound to the head. And the official cause of death was ruled to be a suicide, and yet the evidence is overwhelming that this was not a suicide. I'm quoting here from his letter that he sent to his friends. He said, "Under no circumstances whatsoever will I ever commit suicide." He did say, I don't want to sound hysterical, but his wife had been concerned, so he just wanted to make sure everybody understood he would not kill himself. He said, "This would be completely contrary to my whole nature and to my religious convictions." He said, "If any note was found to the opposite effect in my handwriting, it would be fake." And yet a fake note was found where he supposedly explained why he was committing suicide. Do you think he changed his religion? Do you think he changed his whole nature so that he could commit suicide? Folks, don't be ridiculous. This man was killed. He was murdered. And how exactly they did it, we don't know, but it's very clear that it was a murder. One of the interesting facts here is that the bullet wound was to his right temple, and he was left-handed. Interesting. Never heard of a left-handed person using a gun with their right hand. That'd be very weird. So there's been a number of theories that have come out over the years. Did Soviet agents murder him and just arrange it to look like a suicide? Did they drug him or hypnotize him and get him to murder himself? Did they threaten his family or something and force him to kill himself? And we, at this point, we'll probably never know. His body was actually cremated just 3 days after he died, and so we don't know whether there were any psychotropic substances in his bloodstream. But there was an incredible investigation and examination of the evidence that actually appeared in a predecessor to the New American Magazine. It appeared in May of 1960 in American Opinion, which was one of the predecessor publications of the New American. Incredible piece. It was called The Bang-Jensen Tragedy, a review based on the official records. I can't encourage you to read this highly enough. All members of the John Birch Society can access this for free. It's available to members, and even non-members can get it for $5 downloading it in the archives over at shopjbs.org. But truly an incredible story, and thanks to Epstein for bringing it out. He served in the Office of War Information. He was a research associate at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. He also wrote for National Review, Human Events, and a lot of different European newspapers. He also was the first serious scholar to tackle and write an in-depth study on Operation Keelhaul after the end of World War II, where Eisenhower, yes, that Eisenhower, the president, rounded up millions of refugees from the Soviet Union fleeing from communism, many of whom, incidentally, had helped America in World War II, and sent them back to that butcher, to that monster, Joseph Stalin, so that they could be tortured, executed, and murdered. Unbelievable, folks. So we can thank Epstein for getting that information out. He also, Epstein was also one of the key people exposing the Katyn Forest massacre, where over 20,000 Polish patriots were murdered by the Soviet military in one of the most monstrous war crimes imaginable. And this is what Epstein said. He said that one of the mysteries still not solved, there's little probability that it ever will be solved, concerns the question, did Bang-Jensen commit suicide or was he murdered? This question cannot be answered until we know where he was and what he did during the 30 to 48 hours before his body was found in the park near his home at Lake Success in New York. Why did he not contact his wife during those hours? Was he kidnapped, put under some drug like scopolamine, or perhaps hypnosis? Was he forced under such circumstances to write the suicide note later found in his pocket? These possibilities cannot be dismissed lightly. But he said there's one strong indication that the death of Paul Bang-Jensen was not brought about by suicide. Under normal conditions, we should assume that Paul Bang-Jensen, having solemnly excluded the possibility of suicide, would have referred to this memorandum in his final suicide note if he ever felt himself forced to change his mind, because he must have known very well that his friends would immediately suspect foul play if his body was found with a suicide note penned in his own handwriting. They would rightly suspect foul play because he had so carefully warned them against such an occurrence. Seems pretty obvious, folks, right? And yet they didn't think to ask this. Now, the U.S. Senate Committee on Internal Security, a subcommittee, did end up looking at this evidence, and they did point to very serious evidence suggesting that this was not a suicide, but rather a murder. They said that Bang-Jensen may have been the victim of political murder dressed up as suicide. And I'm quoting here from their subcommittee report. There are too many solid arguments against suicide, too many unanswered questions, too many serious reasons for suspecting Soviet manipulation and the possibility of Soviet implication. Okay, that was from the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. The document suggested that the Soviet secret police may have been involved. They may have very well decided to take Bang-Jensen in for the purpose of finding out what contacts he had, how much he knew, and how much he had already told American authorities. If Bang-Jensen was taken into custody for such an interrogation, his liquidation would have been the inevitable sequel. Okay, pretty obvious that this was not a suicide, folks. It's tragic, and I wanted to share this with you guys because it's such a tragic story. You know, there have been so many heroes who have stood up against the deep state over the years, whether that be the communist arm of the deep state or the officially non-communist arm of the deep state, right? In his book, Tragedy and Hope, Carol Quigley explained very clearly that this roundtable group, they have no aversion to cooperating with communists, and they frequently do so, right? And so many people have paid the ultimate price in resisting this evil, and Bang-Jensen is one of those. And today, when UN whistleblowers are being fired and terrorized and smeared in the news, I thought it was important to just bring this back out and remind everybody that there are some great people who have literally given their lives to try to expose these people, to try to do what was right, and to try to sound the alarm so that people could understand what evil was going on. The psychiatrist who examined Pavel Bang-Jensen ended up telling the Chicago Tribune, he said, "I have difficulty believing it was a suicide. It was not in his makeup." And again, that's the psychiatrist who examined him. He said that Bang-Jensen was possibly the most intelligent man I ever met, and he could very well believe that there was dirty work behind his death. So, very sad story, folks, but a true hero who unfortunately is not very well remembered today, but should be, Pavel Bang-Jensen, a freedom fighter who stood up to the Nazis, who stood up to the communists, and who really should be a role model to Americans and to freedom fighters all over the world to this day. You've got to do the right thing, even if it's hard, even if there are consequences. And folks, I think this tells you a little bit of something about the United Nations as well. There never was a time when the UN was a good organization. You hear a lot that, oh, the UN is broken now, or the UN's been taken over by evil people. Folks, this has been true from the very beginning, okay? The UN is a cesspool of evil and corruption, and it is very clearly an arm of the deep state that is so dangerous. The globalists right now are working on turning it into a one-world government, and yet for over 50 years, this is the kind of behavior we have seen from the highest echelons of this organization. That's all we have time for today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Alex Newman. This is Behind the Deep State for the New American Magazine. Please go to thenewamerican.com. Subscribe to the print magazine if you are not subscribed yet. And stay tuned. We'll be back with more next week. Thanks again, and God bless you all. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe, hit like, hit that little bell so that you'll be notified whenever we post new videos. And also, please make sure to share this video with your friends. Email's a great way to do it. Remember, there are powerful forces working to steal our freedom and destroy our country. We need to work together, expose those behind the deep state. Otherwise, you can kiss your liberties goodbye.